Hey, well, very warm welcome again, everybody. My name is Seb Crutch. If I've not had the pleasure of meeting you before, I'm one of the psychologists at Red Dementia Support and the Dementia Research Centre. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you to this session of the Late Stage Carers Group. Just a brief couple of housekeeping announcements before we get started, just to remind you that this session is recorded, both so that you can listen back afterwards and that others who've registered can also hear these recordings and talks and discussion points whenever is and wherever is convenient for them. We will be having a question and answer session at the end. And there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your panel. So we'd really encourage you, as you're listening through, to be thinking of questions, be thinking of experiences that you want to share, and offering your perspectives on what you've heard. And that doesn't just mean agreeing along, that also means feeling free to share questions and experiences that perhaps are different to those you're hearing discussed. And we will try and present as many of those as we can at the end of the session, but also just to encourage you that both because this session is recorded and also because we can share slides and resources, please feel free just to relax and listen and sort of feel as if you're participating as much as you can in the conversation, rather than feeling like you need to be busily writing down notes of everything. We will give you all the key information again after the session. So the idea for these sessions usually is that we try and dance around a few different topics to cover different perspectives, different experiences, and of course, this group caters to people not only who are different themselves, but who are also living with a variety of different types of dementia. But the idea and the theme for today was perhaps to focus down a little bit more on a small set of issues, quite sensitive issues, fundamentally around what's going to happen when the person that you're caring for and about needs more care or a different type of care than is the current situation. So today we'll be thinking about what that looks like, describing some of the scenarios, some of the realities, some of the things you might have experienced already in part, or are concerned that you might experience, thinking about some of the decisions that you might be faced with, thinking about issues like how to keep everyone involved in that situation safe, and also considering some of the scenarios and processes that people tend to shy away from a little bit when considering later stages of care, such as sectioning. So Liz, great to see you. Thank you so much for joining. We will see you. You're visible at the moment, so feel free to go off camera for now, and I'll introduce you in a little while if that's okay. And just a continued welcome if you're just joining us. Please feel free to come on in and be part of the session. So in discussing these sensitive issues, I just wanted to say that just to reassure you really that we are highly conscious that some of these issues are quite difficult to discuss. Perhaps you have wanted to discuss them with someone before and haven't had the opportunity. And as with any difficult situation we face in life, we will take a different approach to this. Some of us will have a tendency to rush on in, want to look at something closely, gather all the facts, make lists, make plans. Others of us will want to react in a very different way. It may have been really hard for you even to join this session today or to click on this link whenever and wherever you're listening to this. And that's completely understandable. Lots of us take the approach that we don't want the possibility of what might happen to tomorrow to in any way cast a shadow on today. But our aim really for today is to try and gently and carefully explore some of these issues in a way that's manageable for everybody. We want to unpick some of the myths and misconceptions around some of these changes and situations you might be faced with. We want to demystify some of the complex processes. And above all, we want to encourage you and to enable you to face whatever may be coming down the road with just that little bit more clarity and confidence. So I hope that can be the spirit in which we discuss all these issues. If there, as always with our meetings, there may be some things that are hard to listen to, and we always encourage people to take away with you what's useful for you and to leave what's not, leave behind what isn't right for you or may not be right for you just now. But we hope that with the fantastic set of speakers, and that includes members of Rare Dementia Support who've lived these scenarios and professionals from both within and outside the RDS team, that we can have a kind of fairly wide-ranging discussion of these topics, present a number of different perspectives and scenarios, and that will help you to contemplate as much as is right for you next steps and things that you might face in the future. So without further ado from me, it's my great pleasure to welcome Claire Waddington on the screen. Claire's going to be talking about unsafe situations, triggers, risks and strategies. So without any further ado, Claire, over to you.
Thanks, Seb. Can I just check that you can see my slides okay?
We can, thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Seb. And thank you everybody for joining us today. If you are coming to the session without any knowledge or experience around what we're discussing today, including the sectioning process, you are absolutely not alone in this. My lovely colleague Trish will be taking us step by step through this information later on in the session to help navigate some of the queries and misconceptions around the process. And she'll also be touching on the fact that sometimes sectioning can be a really helpful process. So I'm going to first be speaking a little bit about strategies to minimise risk. And just a big thank you to my lovely colleague Karen for her help in putting together this presentation. So we know that sometimes a crisis can happen, and while we can't always necessarily predict this, there are situations where the crisis could have either been minimised or avoided by taking some steps in advance. And when we're talking about a crisis, we're generally talking about a situation where the person living with dementia and or those around them are at immediate risk of harm. I just really want to highlight here, as Seb has already touched on, that what we're talking about is not designed to scare you or to make you worry that you will go through a crisis yourself. It's to prepare you with resources and information to help prevent the likelihood of a crisis occurring. And because it's a really big topic, we've included some links to additional resources throughout the presentation, and we will share these following the session as well. So people might enter into a crisis situation due to a lack of support, which might then lead to carer stress and burnout. We know that a lot of people find it really difficult to accept support for a number of reasons. So people might feel that they have a responsibility to take care of the person living with dementia, and can also feel a lot of guilt at the thought of having additional support. People also worry that the person with dementia won't accept additional help and that this might cause them distress. We also often have people telling us that they don't know what help is available or actually where to go to ask for help as well. So people often start with informal support from friends, family members, and neighbours. People often really want to help, but may not actually understand what help you really need. And in order for the support to be the most effective, you need to be very clear about what help would be most beneficial. So, for example, could it be helpful for someone to provide some company for the person living with dementia for an hour once a week? Could they go for a walk with the person living with dementia at a particular time on a regular basis? And is there a particular activity that they could support that person with? So there will come a time where more formal support will likely be needed, whether that might be care in the home, supporting the person to attend a day centre, having a respite period, or potentially transitioning to a care or nursing home environment. In regards to concerns around refusing to accept support, we would usually look at gradually introducing this, potentially starting with some form of companionship. as the person's needs increase, the care and support needs to increase alongside this. It's really important to note that at no point is it a failure on your behalf as a carer if the person living with dementia's needs are greater than what you can support on your own. Dementia is incredibly complex. Rare dementias, potentially even more so. And you absolutely need to give yourself permission to access the support that is needed. So there are a number of different ways to access support. And one of the ways to determine what support might be needed and what might be available is called a carers and a needs assessment in England. It might be potentially slightly different language depending on where you live, but basically this is support through your local social services. It's also really important to think about having an emergency care plan in place in case there's a situation where you cannot provide care. And this is to ensure that replacement care will be provided for the person living with dementia. So I've included a link to the Carers UK information here, but please do contact your local carers organisation for additional support with this process, as well as local dementia organisations, so places like the Alzheimer's Society, for example. So while there are some types of dementia where fluctuation in symptoms are common, so for example, when we think about Lewy body dementia, in general, where we see a sudden or rapid change in a person's symptoms or in their behaviour, this may indicate a physical health need. So if there is a sudden change in symptoms, for example, the person with dementia seems suddenly very confused or very agitated, this should always be raised as soon as possible with the GP to rule out potential causes. And we're talking about things like urinary tract infections and other infections, unmanaged health needs. So for example, the person with dementia might be dehydrated, or they might be constipated, or they may have another health condition that's not being managed properly, potentially because of their dementia. And this is things like diabetes, for example. If the person has difficulties with communication, we may need to have a think about whether they might be in pain. And we might be able to tell this by things like body language, facial expression, changes in appetite, and physical symptoms. So for example, if they have things like a temperature, but again, we'd want support from a healthcare professional with this. Also, if the person's recently changed medications, then we might also want to assess this as a potential cause of new or sudden symptoms. So I'm going to very briefly focus on delusions, hallucinations, and aggressive behaviours here. Again, just to reiterate, this is not to say that the person living with dementia will develop these symptoms, or to say that it will lead to a crisis situation if they do. So general strategies for managing and supporting someone with these symptoms are firstly to look at the environment and what might be triggering the person. So for example, when we think about hallucinations, things like mirrors, low lighting that might be creating some complex shadows, and also hanging clothing can often increase the likelihood of misperceptions. So keeping a note of what context these behaviours are occurring in can sometimes help us to figure out what might be triggering this so that we can minimise that trigger. We also want to acknowledge and validate the person's emotions. We want to meet the person living with dementia where they are in a calm and reassuring way, trying not to contradict them where possible. If you as a carer appear to be the trigger for that person's distress, then it can be really helpful to leave the room for a short period to give you a chance to just take a breath, and also to give the person living with dementia a bit of space. For aggressive behaviours, using some de-escalation techniques can be helpful. So things like remaining calm in our tone and in our body language, keeping a distance where possible, and also removing yourself from the situation if possible and if needed. Also having an exit plan in place. So for example, keeping yourself close to the door, keeping a key, your phone and some money with you at all times, and having an emergency bag packed somewhere accessible. Also, ensuring that health and social care professionals are aware of these behaviours if they are occurring. If at any point you are worried about the safety of the person living with dementia or your own safety, then you absolutely do need to contact emergency services as soon as possible. We know that this isn't easy and that different strategies will work for different people, and also may work some days and not others. If you have tried making environmental and behavioural modifications, but the delusions, hallucinations, or aggressive behaviours are still occurring, and if they are causing distress, please do raise this with your GP and or your consultant to discuss whether medication might be appropriate, and also whether you might be able to have a referral to the local community mental health team for additional support with this. So I know that's a very brief summary of techniques and strategies there. So we've included some additional resources, including some fantastic talks. So one from my colleague Ida around using behavioural records, and my colleague Livy around managing agitation and aggressive behaviours in dementia. And the Alzheimer's Society also has a number of resources that might be helpful here as well. So the final area that I'm going to touch on is around support with falls prevention and safety concerns in the home. So if the person living with dementia is at risk of falls, potentially because of mobility or perceptual difficulties, then it can be really helpful to look at modifying the environment. So for example, removing clutter and trip hazards, using contrasting colours on steps and door frames, and ensuring that there's adequate lighting as well. You can also ask the GP whether it's possible to refer to a local falls prevention service for additional support, as well as whether a medication review might be helpful here. So finally, it might not be possible to be with the person living with dementia at all times, and it might also not be necessary to do so. There are a number of devices and assistive technologies that can help to increase the person's safety as well as their independence within the home, and also help to minimise some of these risks. So I've included some things here, but there's definitely more available. So things like personal safety alarms, automatic fall detectors, so they don't require the person to press a button, automatic shut-off valves for things like gas and for water, GPS trackers, door alarms, sensor lights that turn on automatically, and also key safes that can help enable trusted people to access the home if needed. So it can be really helpful to have support from an occupational therapist as to what options are available, and also what's most suitable for the person living with dementia with their specific needs. And we've included some additional links to resources and websites around assistive technology and also around safety in the home. So I know that was a lot of information to cover in a really short amount of time. So please do feel free to pop any questions that you have in the Q&A. If you have a query that's a bit more in depth and requires a bit more one-to-one support, please do contact the direct support team using this email address here. But thank you so much, and I'll hand back to Seb now.
Great, thank you so much, Claire. That's a really helpful and comprehensive, but also concise overview of some topics which maybe people will be new to some of those ideas. And even if you've heard some of those ideas before, I think one of the key words that many people in our groups talk about is the notion of sort of drip feeding, the idea of actually hearing something again. Maybe I've heard it before, but now I'm in a slightly different place, or there's something, an element of that which is useful now, which wasn't relevant before. So whatever stage and situation you're in, I hope that was very helpful. Thank you, Claire. So moving swiftly on, it's now a pleasure to welcome Mike Aylwin and Nikki Zimmermann onto the screen. And I'm not sure quite whether these guys are going to end up interviewing each other, or whether Nikki be doing all of the interviewing, because as you'll hear, Mike has some skills and expertise in this area. But anyway, I shall hand over to Mike and Nikki to talk about making difficult decisions for my family.
Thank you, Seb, and good morning to everyone. It's lovely to be here with the late stage carers session again. And I'm delighted this morning that Mike's joining us. Good morning, Mike.
Good morning, Nikki. Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. So can you give us a little bit of a background about yourself and Vanessa to start off with, please?
Yes, well, I met Vanessa in 2004 in a seedy nightclub in Clapham. And we were probably, well, she was a couple of years older than me, but I would have been 32, I think. And we were married a couple of years later. She was a very successful marketing executive. I was and am a sports writer. She stopped working when our firstborn was on the way, so that was in 2007. And then we had two children, another one in 2010, and Vanessa was, the mum and the dynamo behind the home, and so on. And then obviously hanging over all of this was the fact that her mum had died of Alzheimer's in 2006. I never actually met her. Obviously, part of the terrible repercussions of this condition is that it can, as it did with Vanessa's family, kind of blow the family apart. Vanessa was a different stage of life. She'd left home, as had her elder sister, when their mum started to get ill. But Vanessa was always gripped by the conviction that she was going to go the same way. And my role was essentially, over the years, ongoing dialogue, which really pretty much started within a few months of us meeting, was to say, don't be ridiculous. I know your mum died of Alzheimer's, but the chances of you doing the same are tiny. I was niggled by the realization that if it's early onset, then the chances are higher that it might be genetic. But I don't know where I got this idea from. It turned out to be wrong. I thought even if it was genetic, there was still only a 25% chance that she would have it. Of course, that should have been a 50% chance. And as ill luck would have it, she got the wrong side of the coin. Her sister would appear to be okay. So as the years progressed, her symptoms started to creep in. Initially it was the odd sort of fairly extraordinary lapse in short-term memory, usually involving a conversation we just had. But they were very occasional and it didn't really matter. That probably first started happening about 2012, 2013. by 2015, I was beginning to keep a diary of symptoms, but I still didn't. There were plenty of other explanations, not least, the madness of being a mum, running around, constantly trying to keep on top of everything. Then she was diagnosed relatively early with perimenopausal. So the menopause presented itself as another possible explanation as the symptoms started to gather. Then towards the end of 16, it was starting to get a little bit concerning. And then 17, quite alarmingly so. She had a curious episode of sort of vertigo-like symptoms towards the end in September 2017, which required the ambulance to come and take her away. And she had an MRI scan shortly after that, and that was kind of a crunch moment for all of us. I mean, I was trying to impress upon them how much of a this is the coming together of all her fears, basically. And by then, I think I was satisfied it must be Alzheimer's. I was expecting this scan to reveal the fact that she had what she'd always been terrified of. But actually, it turned out that her scan was clear as a bell. And she had another attack in December that year, which then brought us to the attention of St. George's and the neurology department there. So we sort of bypassed the GP. But, because of her clear scan, they were reluctant to consider Alzheimer's. And so we investigated all sorts of other things. But 2018 was really when her symptoms started to unwind quite spectacularly. And her ability to be a mum gradually broke down. And she was finally diagnosed in 2019.
It's a long sort of way of getting there, and sort of really sad and unfortunate, obviously, which we see with the familiar Alzheimer's disease and familiar FTD as well, that there's always that thought there at the beginning, that seed that's there, which makes it sort of even more traumatic, sort of wondering and worrying what's going to happen. So with Vanessa, she did become, over the years and sort of since diagnosis, much more impaired at home. And can you tell me a little bit more about the sort of problems at home and any sort of incidences and the difficulties that you had there?
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, I suppose in those early 2017, 2018 years, it was just a question of, well, I mean, she had an increasingly, and again, part of the problem with all of this is, where does personality end and condition begin? And there is no answer to that. It sort of segs, they both seg into each other. So her relationship with the kids, my son in particular, started to get pretty fraught. Again, that's not necessarily unusual, but looking back, it sort of explains quite a bit. And then in terms of just executive administrative tasks, I just noticed that they were not being done anymore bit by bit. So increasingly I was, initially you start going, you haven't done X, you haven't done Y. And then you start to realize I'm just going to have to do it. I mean, there's no point in pointing it out anymore. So you take on board bit by bit the various admin tasks, and then the sort of, I mean, I'd always done getting the kids up in the morning and putting them to bed at night, so that didn't change. But Vanessa did the cooking, and that started to become a problem. So yeah, by 2019, she totally, really, she still walked them to school and walked them back, but by then it was just as much the other way around. They were walking her, really. And there were obviously multiple occasions, if I was away, where she either turned up early at school or late, or didn't turn up. Then after diagnosis, by then, so yeah, that would have been kind of summer of 2019. Well, by now she could no longer read or write. I mean, physically do it, but also I don't think she had the concentration. Even if she did have the physical ability, she couldn't concentrate long enough to do it anyway. And we went to Trinity Hospice in Clapham, and then we met somebody then who we would engage on a private basis as a sort of main source of advice and care. And she was a huge help in the years that followed. But yes, I mean, it started to get more erratic at home, basically. We also, lockdown then happened as well, which actually helped, I think. I mean, generally I work from home anyway, so I was always on hand, and then the kids were at home, which kind of helped me to sort of, it felt a little less claustrophobic with just, you know, if it was just me and Vanessa. But, you know, you end up really having a third child in the house, and one that needs far more help than the other two. So I would have been dressing her every day and undressing her every day. She could still sort of spoon food into her mouth, but if it needed cutting up, I'd need to do that, and it would sort of go everywhere. Clearly, you could no longer have a conversation with her about, I don't know, family, household decisions. So I suppose you feel a bit more isolated in that respect. Then there is, of course, the volatility of temper. And that works both ways. I mean, you know, they don't necessarily, I found, tell you just how annoying on a day-to-day superficial level, how annoying dementia is. And it works both ways. I mean, God, I used to annoy Vanessa, and she obviously annoyed me. You do clearly develop a sort of a strategy whereby you don't allow it to annoy you quite as much as it should. You're obviously constantly telling each other that, or you're telling yourself and telling her that, you know, this is not you, this is the disease. So, I mean, we always understood that. And actually that very often was a good way of diffusing some of the situations. I remember stupidly, we decided we'd always wanted to get the kitchen done, and she got a diagnosis. And I think one of the first things you don't do when you have a diagnosis of dementia is start inviting builders into the house. But we thought, well, if we don't do it now, it's not going to happen. And so we did that, and we had a terrible episode where I took her to the Alzheimer's Society in Merton. And it's anyway, she wouldn't leave the car, and I had the meeting in the car park with the Alzheimer's Society, and but then I couldn't drive her home because the builders were in the house, and I couldn't take her to a cafe or anywhere because she was raging. So we just drove around Wimbledon for 2 hours, and what diffused it in the end was just saying, look, I understand this is not you, this is the disease. And that was such a relief to her. So I don't think she'd realised that it was the disease. And she thought, God, yes, right. And then we were in a situation where we could go for a spot of lunch. So, I mean, there are a lot of little things like that that help in the sort of midterm. Then, of course, even that ability to have those sort of conversations deteriorates. And last summer was, I think, our kind of where it all came to a head. I knew that at some point she would have to leave the family home, just mainly because of the kids, and that realization kicked in the summer. I always wondered what it would be that finally made us realize, and I imagined it would be incontinence or something like that, but actually it was just she started refusing my help, and that created all sorts of difficulties with just household management. And she started to raise her fist, and then she started to hit me. I never saw her hit the kids, but our daughter twice said she had hit her. She kicked my son once. She started to raise her fists, refuse to cooperate, and hit the carers, or the carer that we had on top of the Trinity carer. We had another carer who came in on a daily basis by then. So we were at a point where, and I sat the kids down in the end of July and said, look, there's two ways of dealing with this. Either she goes to a home, or she stays here, but somebody would have to move in with us. We'd have to have a carer move in. When she can no longer navigate the stairs, we'll have to sort of seal off the living room. We sort of got an open plan downstairs, seal off the living room, and that will become a kind of hospital room, if you like. And even as I was saying it, I thought, well, that's not fair on the children. It's not fair on any of us, really. And I was relieved when they both said, without really having to think about it, she'd have to go into a home. My daughter was crying at that point. Then by a month later, end of August, my daughter was asking, when's she going, Dad? When is she going? So we knew then it had to happen. I was concerned about the process of it. I literally had visions of her kicking and screaming as I drove her away, and I think that probably would have happened, but in the end, sort of fate intervened, I suppose. She had a seizure in the small hours of the morning. I later worked out 17 years and about 4 hours after we first met, exactly, in that nightclub. She had a seizure in bed. I called the ambulance. She got taken away. And it was, well, we couldn't see her for the first 5 days because it was COVID still. And then when I did see her, it was very obvious she wouldn't be able to come home. She couldn't move, really. She couldn't walk, she couldn't talk. So I in the meantime, I'm frantically going around trying to find a home that would take her. That was another big problem because she was only 51, nearly 52 at the time. Most places just said, well, she's under 65, we can't have her. Also, by then she was on risperidone, an antipsychotic drug. So many other places said, well, we can't administer that. We don't have the sort of nursing levels. And also that's indicative of some behavioural problems, which again, we can't have because most of our residents are a certain age and they're vulnerable, and we can't have a 51-year-old strutting around in a rage. So it was quite hard finding somewhere, but when we did, that she got transferred by ambulance, and within a couple of first week or so, I think she suddenly got up out of her chair and walked. So she's got her walking back, although it's not much more than a shuffle now on a bad day. On a good day, she'll walk as much as she ever did. But she hasn't got her talking back. But she's in this home. It's a great place. I can't say she's loving it. I can't be sure because I can't speak to her anymore, but I go down obviously 3 or 4 times a week. And the situation at home, as terrible as it is to say, is just much more stable. And, I hope the kids next few years for the kids will be better for them in the long run than if we tried to deal with it all in home.
Thank you for your honesty there, Mike. I think there's so many bits of that people are really going to take. I mean, the way that you feel yourself, how you reacted to Vanessa at the time, how she reacted to you, and, the complete and utter annoyance of the dementia, which, we all see, and, it's just something that it isn't talked about. And
well, I think that is important because you do go around. I spent a long time on resources like yours, watching the videos of other people and reading articles, and perfectly obviously what comes through again and again is the sort of love will get us through, all that kind of thing, which is true. But I sometimes read that after I just had the latest raging argument and think, oh Christ, what a failure I am, etc. Which, it's fine. I get that is all part of the journey, and everyone probably listening has found themselves in that situation as well. And it's important to remember that however much we talk about love getting us through, there are some pretty ugly moments along the way, and they're normal. Well, insofar as anything's normal with this.
We're all only human after all. Now, I'm just a bit mindful of time, but one thing I do really want to sort of touch on before we end the interview is continuing healthcare funding, because we've had lots of conversations about this, and I'm sure with all of our members watching today, it's a battle. It's a real battle, and I know you've been battling. And do you feel that there's such a lack of understanding with the process that, having Vanessa living in a home is the only option for you and your family?
The trouble is, if I don't know what you mean by lack of understanding the process. If we're on a crude level, it is a labyrinth. It is, and if you are in any, if Vanessa were, if we'd never met in that nightclub, she's not married, met anybody else, I shudder to think what would be happening now. There's no way I'm struggling to get to the bottom of what some of these things mean, and I think the NHS probably deliberately makes it very vague about just what represents what they call a primary health need. So in case anyone doesn't know, if you qualify for a primary health need, regardless of means testing, you get the funding from the NHS rather than the local authority. And they really don't make it clear when you've got a primary health need. And it would seem the bar is set incredibly high. And I'm told almost always you get turned down initially, and we indeed have been turned down. We're now appealing, and I think you just have to keep appealing and appealing and appealing. But we're not talking about something, if their game plan is to sort of put people off so that only a very few actually do end up appealing enough, the alternative, I'm afraid, is extortionately expensive. And it's just not possible for people not to keep appealing and appealing until they get the funding. And if we don't get the funding, I don't know what happens. She'd have to come back home. That, I think, would create some major problems. So it's, I realise no one anywhere in government or anywhere else actually has got any money at the moment, and I suppose that's part of the problem. Coming off the back of COVID and everything, they just can't afford to fund everybody, I suppose, because it's really, the place Vanessa's at is 100, and they've just put their fees up for more pressure for everybody, £110,000 a year. The cheapest place I could find around here, South London, Southwest London, Southeast, that said we can have her, we've got the facilities for her, was 75 grand a year, and you really wouldn't want to take the children Let's put it that way. The place she's at is beautiful. It's family run, it's independent, and that was a big part of it, because normally they're all part of a chain and they've got hoops they need to jump through, and if you're under 65, that's it. The place she's at still had to apply for a license to have her, because they only were licensed to have people over the age of 60. But they were because they were independent, they were able to write to whoever it was they had to write to, and they got an answer within a day or two. So that was all fine. But that is a huge amount of money. Most people couldn't even dream of it. I'm like, my dad is footing the bill for a while, but clearly can't carry on for very much longer. Meanwhile, Vanessa had pension money that came in, and her dad died, which anyway, we ended up with about a pot of about 80 grand, and we spent 50 of that just from carers coming and going over the period, over 2 years. But most of that 50 grand was in the second year, not the first. So whichever way you dress it up, it's horrendously expensive. And if you've got more than 23 grand in savings, or at least if the person who has the illness has got 23 grand or more in savings, then you just have to spend those savings until you fall below that level. It's a mad, brutal, horrible
process. Well, we hope we can sort of help, and with our legal team, with Michael helping, hopefully we'll get through this. So we hope so very much indeed. Mike, we're going to leave that there at the moment. You will be on the Q&A panel, so please, anybody, if they have some questions for Mike, please set them in and we will tackle them a little bit later. We're going to hand back to Seb, and thank you once again, Mike.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely sincere thanks to you both, and Mike especially for your candidness and your honesty and your clarity with which you've described those heartbreaking decisions. So as Nikki said, we'll come back and you'll have the opportunity to put questions to Mike a little bit later on. But for now, we could just get, in the interest of time, we're just going to move swiftly on to the fantastic Trish O'Hara, part of the direct support team, who's going to be talking to us about what is sectioning, facts versus myths. Trish, very warm welcome to you.
Hello, Seb. Hello, everybody. Okay, so I'm going to talk about things following on from some of the stuff that's been talked about already. Thank you. I was very moved by that, Mike. I hadn't heard your particular story, and it was very movingly described. And I guess, my take from that is it's very true. The truth is, love is often not enough when it comes to dementia, and we wouldn't expect love to be enough to fix a broken leg or to sort a broken leg out. We have to sometimes go to professionals, and professionals need to be part of the person we love's care. And it's really good support to get them that care. And of course, most of the time, we can perhaps do that following a process that we heard from Mike, where we can see things changing. But of course, there are times, and I'm going to share my screen now, where we come into a situation where things become quite dangerous. And I want to make it clear before I share my slides that not everybody living with a dementia, not everybody will get to a position where, however their diagnosis might be erratic, such as frontal temporal lobe behavioural variant, or indeed Lewy body dementia, where perhaps we see more activity from the person or actions from the person where they're feeling angry, feeling upset, more frustrated. And of course, it does sometimes happen that people become so angry, so frustrated, so afraid themselves that they become dangerous to others and themselves. And then we have to think about how we deal with that situation in an emergency. I do want to say, though, regardless of diagnosis, not everybody who has a diagnosis of behavioural variant frontal temporal lobe or Lewy body or any other dementia will become dangerous. That's not always the case. And everything we heard from my lovely colleague Claire around risk reduction is really vital information, because as the steps change, as a person becomes more frustrated, more worried, more frightened, more angry, less able to express themselves, and therefore more challenging to us, we can and should think about all the ways we can minimise risk and also take the path of least resistance, really. Sometimes, without a doubt, we want the person to either learn to improve how they're acting, or we become angry with them ourselves, as Mike described. And I'm really pleased that we heard from Mike there, because it would be extremely saintly to say that we wouldn't feel angry or frustrated as carers. And of course, we too, as carers, people who are carers, are going to lose their temper at times or be angry, because it's extremely exhausting and frustrating. But, you know, getting through episodes of, you know, real anger, real upset doesn't mean automatically that the person is going to become dangerous. But we can do an awful lot to minimise that risk, especially really trying not to make them see or making a conflict, but accepting that the person's feeling angry and moving away and leave them feel their anger, and then trying to maybe distract or offer some engagement that's a bit, or just talk to them in a way that perhaps calms them down or makes them feel a bit better, without expecting sorries, or without expecting them to understand why they've acted in a terrible way. In fact, something I learned about dementia a long time ago is that people don't think their way through dementia. They feel their way. And if somebody's feeling frightened or confused or baffled or disorientated or angry or frustrated, they may express that in a way that's really horrible to everyone else, including the people they love. In fact, more often the people they love, because you're often nearest them. But at times, of course, a person might become so angry that we have to consider what we do as carers and what you do as carers in order to make them safe and make yourself safe. So I'm going to share my slides now, which I had just promised to do. So I'm going to do that now. Give me a moment. Always takes me a little moment to share my slides. Apologies. Now I'm going to use language that you may have already heard of. You may have heard of it off the telly or from other people or in your life generally, or it may be language you're starting to hear about now that you're supporting or caring for somebody at late stages dementia, and you've heard it from either other webinars or from other people or in support groups. And the terms I'm going to use are a bit alarming. The word sectioning or being sectioned can often be really quite scary to people. But let's take a step before we get there. And that is, of course, if you're in a situation where there's an emergency. And I don't doubt that often an emergency for most of us means going to hospital. And going to hospital sometimes is the way that many of these next stages happen, as it did with Mike, actually, when he was worried about how he was going to support his wife to get somehow into hospital or into care home. Actually, what happened is something physical happened and she had a seizure. So it was from hospital that she was then supported to move into a care home. And it's not unusual for hospital to be a place to start changes of where someone lives, often because of a fall or an incident, or some health concern like a seizure. But essentially, of course, sometimes you're just frightened at home. You're frightened of the person that you love perhaps, and perhaps they've loved you and love you. But at the moment, the anger and the frustrations become too much, and the person is now unable to be calmed, and all the things that Claire talked about have been tried and aren't working. And you and your other family members, perhaps children, are feeling quite scared. Now, you know, the reality is the local authority have a duty, and they have a duty to safeguard anybody who has care and support needs. And because of those care and support needs, are unable to safeguard themselves. And you might have heard the term safeguarding linked to the local authority. Now, the truth is, ringing the local authority in an emergency safeguarding situation can be quite complicated, because the duty of the local authority is to safeguard the person living with the care and support needs. And in this instance, it's the person with dementia, though you might be ringing them because you're afraid of the person living with dementia who's become very angry and acting in a way that's unpredictable, frightening, or really quite threatening, and even potentially violent. So without a shadow of a doubt, you may want to ring the local authority. But if you rang the local authority and said, I'm really frightened because, for example, my husband's trying to hurt me, or the children, he's got dementia, the answer from the local authority is going to be ring the police. because the police are there to protect the members of the public. And in that conversation, as a carer, you are a member of the public. So sometimes framing how we talk to the local authority is helpful, and saying to the local authority, I am really in fear for the safety of a person living with dementia. They are really acting very angrily. They've become very violent. They're leaving the house. I don't know what's going to happen to them. I don't know what's going to happen. I think they're really unsafe. This is an emergency. This might get the local authority to you a little bit quicker than the true emergency that this might become, when indeed you do need to ring the police. If you are frightened for your safety to life and limb, or the person you love's safety of life and limb, then the first emergency service is indeed the police, without a shadow of a doubt. The police may come, and if indeed the police come, they can section the person that is frightening you, or you're frightened for their safety. So let's think about what may happen. Potentially, if the local authority are the people that listen to your cries that the person you're worried about is unsafe, then perhaps the law that might be applied here would be the Mental Capacity Act. Whereas if you've rang the police because it's now become too dangerous for you to remain and wait for the local authority, who, let's face it, might take some time to get to you. Even in an emergency, they might not be around for a few days. Although before perhaps the changes in cuts and the changes in the local authorities' funding, and indeed before the pandemic, local authority would try to get to you within 24 hours, in fact, within a few hours. But that's not necessarily the case now. So you might need to ring the police. I mean, when you're in the police are going to use the Mental Health Act. Now, what I want to explain, I guess, is how these interface a little, and the fact that in both cases, if the person is, say, removed from the family home and taken to a place of safety, or taken to hospital, or just taken away from you, that would be called a detention. And being detained is something that, you know, I suppose is another way of describing contained, isn't it, in a way? But it's usually when we're talking about someone who can't give consent to that at that moment, contained or detained against their will. Now, the big difference between how we might detain somebody who's needing to be detained using the Mental Capacity Act is that it has to be evidenced and it has to be proved that they're being detained in their best interests, in the person's best interests. That is the law, that's what's expected. The difference with the Mental Health Act is that a person can be detained not just in their best interests, but potentially in the best interest of others. So in other words, in the Mental Capacity Act, people can be detained regardless, in the Mental Capacity Act, how other people feel. So you might be really worried and saying to the local authority, I need you to take my wife away because we're all really stressed out. Unless it's deemed that the person, that your wife in that situation is sectionable under the Mental Health Act, the Mental Capacity Act can only detain your wife if it's evidence that it's in her best interests. It's not really anyone else's best interests. So that's why at times we do need the Mental Health Act. Otherwise, the Mental Capacity Act will say, well, the family might be stressed, the family might be upset, but it's not necessarily in the best interest of the person living with dementia. So we need the Mental Health Act because sometimes the person is too stressful for everyone else, and it's in fact detrimental to everyone else's safety, in which case the Mental Health Act is very helpful. The Mental Health Act had huge updates. The 1983 Mental Health Act, which was already a renewed piece of law, it had real big, massive changes in 2007, where now, in order for somebody to be detained using the Mental Health Act sections, it has to be evidence that they're being treated for mental ill health, So they can't be detained because they're better off there than anywhere else. They have to be detained for treatment, for what's often referred to in the law as mental disorder. That's the word that I used, mental disorder. We tend to say mental ill health, It's kind of nicer language too. But mental disorder, because it covers a little bit more than mental ill health, such as somebody might have brain damage that's not treatable, but a disorder that means that they have to remain within treatment. So the Mental Capacity Act is what we hope that somebody might be detained under, because that's perhaps a bit more organised using the local authority and perhaps not the police. But there are some other benefits being detained under the Mental Health Act. I'm not going to pretend here, I'm not going to soften this. It's more traumatic being detained under the Mental Health Act. You can't plan it. It's usually in an emergency, really, or at least much more emergency-like. It's usually and often involving the police or somebody that's going through a hospital situation where they're being detained in a hospital following perhaps a fall or an injury, perhaps following an incident. They may be detained in the hospital, and it might be a mental health nurse that's used 72 hours or a 6-day detention section. The word section is really important to know here. The word section is used because it's the section of the Mental Health Act. So section 2, section 3, it's just a section in the Mental Health Act. Maybe that will make us feel less worried about it if we know it's a chapter, essentially, in a larger legal document. Chapter 2 is section 2, chapter 3 is section 3. So it's about that section, it's that piece of law that's being used to detain the person. So we should not be so worried about the word section in many ways, but just understand what piece of law is being used to detain that person. Okay, so let's think about how people might be detained using sectioning. Section 2. Now, when we talk, and it's always about mental disorder, that's the language that's used. So I'm going to use language that's unfamiliar, unpleasant, but hopefully it helps us remember it a little when and if the time comes. And it doesn't, as I want to remind you, always happen, of course, however unwell a person is. The truth is, with mental ill health, that is also associated, or a reaction to living with dementias, is that people can become hyper, overreact to things, or hypo, which is underreact. So we also know that even if someone is diagnosed with behavioural variant, the term behavioural variant, frontal temporal lobe dementia, sometimes their response to that is apathy and actually very withdrawn. Doesn't automatically presume that the person's going to be hyper. Some people might switch from hyper to hypo and become a bit more unpredictable. And again, going back to Claire's reduction of risk, they can be very effective. But eventually, if you've tried all of the reduction and you're still feeling that the person is becoming unsafe for themselves and or you or others, then sometimes we do need to ring the police, or we've rang the local authority and they've come out very quickly and they can arrange, perhaps without the police being involved. Potentially, we can arrange for somebody, and somebody will be arranged to be sectioned on a section 2. Now, what's important about section 2 is it has to be because it's necessary for the safety of the person and or others. It's detainment for potential treatment. In other words, treatment may not start because it's essentially an assessment period. So the treatment might not be agreed or arranged. Somebody might be sedated while being sectioned. That doesn't tend to be the treatment. There's a treatment plan that's arranged following an assessment process. The assessment is usually 28 days. It's almost always just 28 days. In occasional circumstances, they might extend that for another 28 days. But generally speaking, it's a 28-day assessment process. And whilst there's the assessment happening, usually the psychiatric team and the people around the person are trying to work out how the person might be treated. They might sometimes be trying to diagnose the person. Some people are being sectioned before they've had a diagnosis of dementia and actually are going through a section process for mental ill health. And it might be in the section ward in the hospital that it's ascertained, or the psychiatrist has started to recognise this person may have dementia. And we know that there's a lot of discrimination involved in that. In fact, you're more likely, if you're acting erratically in the community and acting in an unexpected way in the community, you're more likely to be sectioned if you're black than if you're white. So the truth is, somebody who's coming from a black community may be sectioned more quickly and freely into a hospital, who actually is living with dementia but yet to be diagnosed, or is diagnosed but out in the community on their own and becoming more unwell or more afraid. So actually there is some discrimination, and there are potentially more people in hospital who are under section for mental ill health, who perhaps are being treated for mental ill health psychosis, who in fact are living with dementia that's yet to be diagnosed or yet to be recognised whilst they're in hospital. So that assessment period is really vital, and psychiatrists are becoming really much more versed with dementia and recognising that not only older people get dementia, as we've heard from Mike, 40s, 50s, 60s, certainly an unexpected age for people to live with dementia, and unexpected behaviour is often assumed to be mental ill health, but actually the person might be living with a younger onset dementia. So that 28-day period is really important, and it's Section 2 of the Mental Health Act. So they're held on a Section 2 and they're detained in that time. And at any point in that Section 2, the person might be re-diagnosed, or they may be supported to calm down because they didn't realise they were living with dementia, and perhaps the diagnosis helps them sort of compose their mental health, as it were. So they're not necessarily going to be detained any longer, and they may be discharged home. And sometimes that can be quite frightening, particularly if people at home have been the people to ring the police because they're very frightened. So generally speaking, there's communication with the family, and communication with where is the person going, and is it appropriate for them to go home? And sometimes it isn't appropriate, and they may need to be then transferred on to a Section 3, which is the next chapter in the Mental Health Act. Again, necessary for the safety of themselves and or others. The treatment for a Section 3 can only be given in hospital, and that's mental health treatment or treatment for mental disorder. And it can be up to 6 months the first time. And generally speaking, then, if it's going to be renewed, it will be for another 6 months, after which it will be renewed yearly, 12 monthly. So it's renewed 12 monthly, and it can be renewed at length, ad infinitum, for any length of time. Though it's important to know that should the person become well, because mental ill health is treatable, and so for the person who might become well, in other words, fix the mental ill health sorted, then they can be discharged at any time. But I guess what we have to accept here is that, you know, dementia presents lots of challenges that can look and mimic mental ill health, but actually in itself, dementia is not a mental ill health. It's a diagnosis of a disease of the brain. So generally speaking, when someone is sectioned because they have dementia, they can be supported to feel safer, and maybe some medication attempts to calm the person, and often that's a little bit more of an art than a science, although I'm sure psychiatrists have a better way of describing that. But there's some work done around how a person can be made to feel safe and perhaps act in a way that's more appropriate. And sometimes the word used is managed. I don't particularly like that term. I think managing people is something we do at work. I don't think we manage people's health. I think we manage ourselves in the way we approach them. But generally speaking, how we support the person to feel better might be that they feel calmer and could be discharged home successfully and live at home with the right treatment and the right support. And perhaps it's a time to up the care that the carer needs, more carer coming in the home. But usually, and quite often, if a person's been sectioned and got to that stage, because it's the emergency level of someone's dementia, quite often that section will be renewed, and the social worker and the discharge team involved will be frantically, quite often, looking for the person to be discharged actually into further support. And they'll be discharged using a Section 117, and that's further down the law. And that's where it's been agreed that the health authority and the local authority share a duty to provide aftercare. And why a section can actually sometimes be extremely beneficial is that an aftercare, and you might have noticed the word on the slide there, the word just before it, an aftercare on a 117, if somebody is discharged from hospital into the community, into a care home on a 117, it might be a nursing home. The truth is it's free. You know, it's fully funded. It is fully funded. And that person will be discharged to go into potentially a care home. And usually as Mike found out when he was looking himself, it's going to take some time to find a suitable environment, a care home, one that can provide the right medication, a care home that is secure, because if somebody's on a section, usually there needs to be some level of security. And what we'll be supported to do living in the community is to sort of live within something called, you'll often hear the term a CTO, and that's a community treatment order. So technically, they're still on a section. So they're on a section, but because it can't be a section 3, because you have to be in hospital for that treatment, when they move back in the community, which is the general need, and most people want to be moved back into the community, and most of the health professionals want people to be moved back in the community. That's the drive, really. It's the right place to be supported with mental ill health or with dementia, where a person's no longer able to be safely in the community without a section, is the section, if you like, 117. It's a bit like having a section 3, but in the community, and they will use a community treatment order managed quite often by a community program approach. So it'll be like a care plan that involves mental health or involves mental health law, mental health act expectations. So it might be antipsychotic medication or maybe not, but it will involve some mental health practitioner to continue to be involved, because technically the person's still on section and they're living in quite often a secure care home. And the secure care home might still have open doors, but what they will hopefully have is secure grounds. So the person can walk and have a real sense of freedom in their care home, and the care home can still be very homely. As we heard from Mike's, although it doesn't sound necessarily that Mike's partner is being detained at this stage using a section. And in fact, Mike's feeling that financially hugely, because when someone's detained using the Mental Capacity Act in their best interests, a different process is used. And that piece of law that's used to detain them is called deprivation of liberty authorization, or safeguard. A deprivation of liberty is often referred to as a DOLS, and that's using the Mental Capacity Act. If somebody doesn't have capacity, they're not sectionable because they haven't got enough to meet the criteria of mental ill health. They may be detained in a care home using DOLS, deprivation of liberty authorization. And that is in order to keep them for their best interest, in their best interests. That language is about to change. The law changed in 2019, but rolling it out's been difficult through COVID. Should have happened by now. And you might hear a change in term called liberty protection safeguards. And it is much better language, because we don't necessarily want to hear a practitioner ring up and say, I'm ringing about deprivation of liberty of your sister. Oh, you're not going to deprive my sister of her liberty. That's terrible. She's got the right to liberty and security as part of the Human Rights Act, Article 5, as long as we hang on to that. You know, the truth is the right to liberty and security is why we have deprivation of liberty authorizations in place. It's to have the same due process of law that you would be used if somebody was detained using the Mental Health Act. And that is the right of representation and the right of appeal. And that's really important. You have that if you're detained in prison. We have the right of representation and the right of appeal. So people detained using the Mental Capacity Act is because they don't have capacity to give consent to their own care and treatment, but it's been agreed by professionals and involving family and power of attorney, hopefully, always, hopefully. It's been more difficult in COVID, but generally speaking, involving power of attorney and family, that we deprive someone of their liberty in their best interests because they are not safe to be living in their own home or at home. So I think it's extremely important for us to recognise that somebody who's been detained using the Mental Health Act, due process of law has been around for a lot longer than the Mental Capacity Act, that had to mirror that, but for people who are not necessarily sectionable within the criteria of being sectioned. The reality is, as Mike is experiencing, is that when you're detained using the Mental Capacity Act, you are not fully funded. It is not fully funded unless you don't have savings, as we know, 23,250. So that is something that you are means tested for and fully contributed to. Whereas if you're sectioned using the Mental Health Act, essentially this is the NHS you are getting, because Mental Capacity Act, if you like, detention in some ways, is more about social care. And social care has always been means tested, and you've always been expected to contribute. Whereas healthcare, as long as we hold on to it, is fully funded by the NHS. And we can see that there's a change when somebody perhaps is being detained using the Mental Health Act. And once they're being detained using the Mental Health Act, indeed, there might come a point where the Mental Health Act is no longer applying and they're going to be sectioned in the community using a community programme approach, but they might start to be being discharged from that. And that can be a worrying time. Usually, though, if somebody is still displaying all the symptoms that come with their dementia that got them sectioned in the first place, there is quite often a turnover to continuing healthcare, which might replace the funding, which is again NHS funded. But please, I'm going to end on this bit here. It's really important if somebody is sectioned and then it's suddenly lifted just before there is potentially going to be a continuing healthcare funding assessment, query that and say, why was this not overlapped? Why suddenly is my loved one, is my brother being discharged from a section, or the Mental Health Act is no longer sectioning my brother, and now you're telling me we have a continuing healthcare assessment process happening. Really, there shouldn't be a big gap in the middle. We should be looking at there being a really good overlap, or at least some arrangement where it's been explained. We are going to join that so that there's not a huge funding gap. So we need to be holding people to account, really. If somebody's being detained using the Mental Health Act because of the symptoms of dementia, then the symptoms of dementia are going to be how they may get funded for the continuing healthcare by the NHS. Then we should see, well, these symptoms, we don't have to reprove them. So we can perhaps, use our voices very loudly to say, why are we proving it again a different way? These are the same symptoms, are they not? So I can see that it's not always smooth, it's not always straightforward, and being sectioned can be extremely traumatic. And I don't doubt for a minute that people would rather avoid it and go through the safeguarding process with the local authority using the Mental Capacity Act. But the silver lining is if somebody is discharged into the community or discharged from hospital into the community on a Section 117 that's fully funded, so there is some help and hope there that at least there's no financial panic on top of everything else. I hope that was helpful. I'm going to stop now and I apologise if I went over time. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Just in the interests of our audience and time, can I call the rest of the panel onto the screen if that's okay? Sorry, it's amazing that in two and a half years of doing remote webinars, we've had very few technical issues like this. So I'm sorry we've had this glitch, but we promise we will get Liz and the fantastic things she has to share with us, share with everyone soon. Liz, welcome back. So sorry about these technical hitches. We were just saying, if you want to, we might, because of the technical issues, we might go to the Q&A now. We wondered if you would like to take a couple of questions just with your camera off. No, it's sorry. No, we're really struggling to hear you. So I think, sorry, Liz, we're not even getting any words now. So it might be worth trying with the camera off. But if not,
can I check that you can hear me now?
We can hear you now. Let's just give you a moment. I'm so sorry about this. To try just seeing if the audio only works.
Sorry, this is the perils of doing this from the NHS, where we have totally inadequate internet.
We completely understand. Not at all.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you quite clearly now. Thank you.
Okay. So my main messages is that this isn't a process we take lightly, and we really kind of are very conflicted about having to do this. So we know that it's often when someone's reached a crisis point and we have no other alternative, because we are depriving someone of their civil liberties. And so we always try and use the least restrictive option possible. It's a really legalistic process, and you can lose the person in the middle of all of that. And also there's a lot of stigma around the process. So we try to be very careful when we're doing this. So as a clinician, it's something that we grapple with and we reflect on, because we're often aware that it's a wider system failure that has led to this happening. And we are kind of having to make up for all of those problems that because of things that have occurred in the community. What the only other points I wanted to make really, really briefly, if you can still hear me, is that obviously there's section 2, which is where we assess people for 28 days. And there's section 3, where we're treating someone. And it's really important to bear in mind that we are assessing and treating the psychiatric symptoms and consequences of the dementia. If there are physical or medical problems, then that's done under the Mental Capacity Act. This is a very confusing area of law, and even doctors get confused by this. I would be happy to take any questions that people have, and that might be a better way. I've made lots of points and notes, but I know we're running out of time. I just wanted to clarify a couple of things. The police can't actually section someone. All they can do is bring them to a place of safety, and that's not an unusual situation. So they can bring them, someone who's out on the streets, to a place of safety, and that's usually a hospital emergency department, which is designated as a place of safety. So that's what the police can do. They can convey someone to the hospital emergency department for medical assessment and treatment. And also in practice, we use community treatment orders very, very rarely. They were set up for more people with younger forensic problems, schizophrenia, that kind of thing. So what I would say, I think, just to conclude, is that especially for carers, do not see that if your loved one is detained under the Mental Health Act, that this is a failure on your part. And often it can be a very therapeutic intervention when it's done properly. And I hope that as doctors who are integral to this process, we make this as therapeutic and as supportive as we can. I'll leave it at that.
Liz, that's brilliant, and we're so grateful to have you with us. And I think the sort of auditory background for us, as well as the technical issues, really shows is an extra evidence and context that you're working on the front line with all of these issues. So thank you so much. If you don't mind, my suggestion is if I bring to you the first couple of questions for you, and then we release you, and we'll do some of the wider questions about some of the earlier sections of the talk, if that's okay. So one of the questions that's already come through to you, which you've spoken to a little bit already, but the question was, what are the responsibilities of the responsible clinician and other professionals in that detention process to communicate and consult with the family, LPA and nearest relatives?
Yep. So the whole process of detaining someone under the Mental Health Act is coordinated by an AMP, an approved mental health practitioner. And that's often, but not always, a social worker. And there is a duty for them to consult with the nearest relative. And the nearest relative is defined in a very legalistic way. There's actually a hierarchy that works its way down: husband or wife, and then down to brother or sister. And then there's a kind of family structure tree that is used. So the approved mental health practitioner, who is coordinating the process of the section and detaining someone under the Mental Health Act, must consult with a nearest relative. That's a statutory obligation under the Code of Practice.
Thank you. That's a very crisp and very clear answer. Thank you. And last one before we let you go, Liz, is someone who was asking, how are the Section 117 aftercare needs assessed, and saying that they were struggling to find a framework like the one for CHC?
I think that's, again, it's not laid out very clearly in statutory law what comprises Section 117 aftercare, and it's very much done on a local needs-based approach that should be part of the discharge planning, often from the mental health ward. It can get complex, especially if the person with dementia has moved around different authorities. It's not the magic bullet necessarily, because what can happen is that if someone with dementia has moved around or has gone into a care home, then different local authorities can end up arguing about who takes on that Section 117 aftercare responsibility. So although it's a better framework and you're more likely to get it, compared to continuing healthcare funding. And in most places, the Section 117 aftercare is provided in a person-centred and a diligent way. Sometimes it isn't. But you then have the Mental Health Act law and advocacy process to fall back onto.
Okay, Liz, thank you so much for joining us today. In the interest of time and your other commitments, I'll let you go for now, and we'll be back in touch to share a few more details that you were going to share with us with the members of the group after the session via email. So thanks ever so much again, Liz. Great. So in the conscious of time and knowing that people may have to slip away, my suggestion, if it's okay, is we've got the panel and the speakers with us here. We're just going to, if you don't mind us bursting through our planned 11:30 finish time just by a few minutes, I thought we'd just take 2 or 3 of the questions that have come through and comments on some of the earlier talks, if that's all right. And I just wanted to start with one. There have been innumerable comments for you, Mike, and someone in particular saying, thank you so much for sharing your story so honestly. What you didn't say, though it came through, was how you and you as the sort of carer and your partner and your family found the ongoing bereavement process as you were talking through the different elements of change in your story, and whether you sensed what was happening in that context of grief and bereavement and loss. I don't know if that's a concept which has sort of occurred to you or chimed with you when you're going through
very
experiences.
Very much. I call it bereavement in installments. Sorry. Nothing I can do about an landline. Grief in installments. There's never a neat moment where it's not like I imagine, say, cancer might be, where life's going along perfectly normally and suddenly it's turned upside down in the space of weeks, months. It's very gradual, creeps up on you. You're constantly interrogating it and yourself and your loved one. I would say the real sort of, and I feel I've got some of it out of my system, was when the penny dropped that she wasn't gonna be coming back through the front door again. That was as if she'd sort of died. Certainly in terms of her presence in our lives, that with realizing. In fact, funnily enough, just coincidentally, I saw the home where she is now in the morning, came away thinking, right, that I could see her there. And then I went straight from there to the hospital to see her for the first time, which was about 5-6 days after she'd gone in. They moved her to another ward where I could visit. And it was then she wouldn't be coming back. And we had a home for her to go to.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I've finished now.
Suddenly, So for the next few days, all the waterworks were unleashed and what have you. Then I was there so her carer went with her in the ambulance for the transfer to the home, and I was at the home with all the staff to accept her. And she was obviously so, I would imagine, although she couldn't speak or walk at the time, so overwhelmingly relieved to be out of the hospital, which was a fairly depressing place for her to be. She was the old sparkle, you could see it, even if she couldn't speak, and the staff were responding to her brilliantly. They, loved her, and then that sort of storm lifted. Then when I drove away, I was felt so much happier about it all. And now, the nice thing about when somebody goes into a home is that all that sort of nitty gritty close quarter care stuff is done by somebody else. I used to see when she was here, her kind of spirits lift when someone from outside came in just to change the drudgery of the rhythm of life at home at the time. And now I'm that person coming in, and she is pleased to see me. She smiles, she laughs. And I suppose our relationship is just so much better now. You know, the next stage of the bereavement process will be when she dies. And, you know, I don't know when that's going to be. It could be soon. It could be far. I mean, her mum didn't die till she was 58, and I'm told it will probably follow a similar course unless something else intervenes before. So if Vanessa's going to live to 58, she's got another, you know, 6 years or so. And then there'll be another bereavement. But I think that bereavement will be easier to deal with because we've already been through various stages.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. That's so helpful, and so also so kind of you to, amidst those difficult decisions and changes, to talk about the silver lining of the benefits of your relationship now, and those positive aspects. Thank you. Claire, I just wondered, before I come on to a different question with Nikki, whether you might just like to say a word or two about some of the bereavement and pre-bereavement grief and loss offerings that are available.
Absolutely. Thank you, Seb. And Mike, thank you so much for being so open about describing your experience. I think it's so important for us to acknowledge that there are the physical challenges in caring for someone with dementia, but there are also a lot of emotional challenges within that process as well. So thank you so much for speaking to that. So we do really want to acknowledge and validate people's grief that they are experiencing when they are caring for someone living with dementia. And we do have a support program that our wonderful colleagues, particularly Jill Walton, have developed to kind of help people to navigate that process and to provide a space where people might be able to speak openly about the impact that caring role is having on them in terms of their own grief experience within a group of other people that might have an understanding about that. And also just to say that we support people who are caring for people at the moment, and we also have support available for people who have cared for someone who has now passed away as well. So we just really want to reiterate that our support is available now and also in the future for people that might want to access that as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Claire. Numerous other comments, Mike, a few will pass on to you about other people similarly with histories of dingy nightclubs in Clapham. But in the interest of time, I thought we'd just take one last question, which relates to something you and Nikki were talking about at the end. Someone has written, I'm about to press the button on my own appeal for CHC funding. I won't be surprised if it's refused again. Nikki, you referred to legal help which may be available, and could you briefly mention a bit more about that?
Yes, certainly. And I suppose really need to put it out there, first of all, is do not be surprised if it's rejected. You know, it really is. We see this all the time. And you know, Mike had his rejected. We help with the process, so we can look through sort of what wording is used on there. And we have Michael, who's in our legal team, and Michael will do a session with you to help you understand what terminology you need to put in there. I think one of the things that was really interesting when we've been working with Mike this week is he's really held back with his language of, you know, underplaying, and you can't, you know, you have to put, this is severe, this is as severe as it's going to be, it's not safe, you know, and quite often in these cases, there's no communication, there's feeding problems, there's breathing problems, there's incontinence, which is going to cause skin integrity problems. So there's so many things. So for anybody who is going through the process or struggling with this, you know, we're more than happy to help. You know, Michael is absolutely fantastic. So please do get in contact with us with this, please.
Great, thank you, Nikki. Well, I must sadly draw things to a close, but I wanted to say a huge thank you again to all of the speakers and contributors today. It really is a testament to your passion for this area, that you're so willing to talk about these difficult and often painful and sensitive issues, and for the benefit of others. So thank you for all of the areas and considerations that you'll have unlocked for people. We will be sending, as I mentioned, details about all the resources we've shared, hopefully a sort of a non-live Q&A with Dr. Liz Sampson, and some slides and other information from today. As Nikki was saying at the end there's a huge battle around these things to be clear, and not to undersell the enormity and variety of different struggles and challenges that you and your loved ones are facing. And part of that is at the individual level, being clear when going for applications to things like CHC, but it's also at a sort of wider community scale. It's also about us trying to state how different the needs are of people with different forms of dementia. And one of the ways in which we try and do that is by inviting you to take part in the Rare Dementia Support Impact Study, where we, with a simple interview, phone or video interview with one of the team, you can tell us about how it's been for you, the challenges you face, what's been helpful, what hasn't been, and what needs to change. So if that's something that you'd like to take part in, please do get in touch with us. We will also be sharing information about that after the session. But for now, we'll let you move on with the rest of your days. A huge thank you to Shema and Millie behind the scenes for organising today's session, again to the speakers, but most importantly to you all for being here, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye for now.
Hello, my name is Eva Tate and I'm the Major Appeals Manager and Manager of the Rare Dementia Support Fund held by the charity The National Brain Appeal. The National Brain Appeal raises money as the dedicated charity for the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery and UCL Queen's Square Institute of Neurology. The National Brain Appeal raises funds for Rare Dementia Support's 2,000 members to help individuals living with rare and early onset forms of dementia, their families, friends, and healthcare professionals. And we also hold several other funds for FTD and dementia research. The funding helps not only the support group meetings in London, but also the regional support groups, admin and support staff, and all other associated expenses, including the new online support groups. When things return to normal, there are travel and accommodation bursaries available to help members attend the meetings. This year, we've raised our fundraising target to 300,000, and this will rise further to 350,000 by 2022 to develop and extend the service in the areas of education, support, and research, with the ultimate aim that everyone affected by a form of rare dementia will have access to specialist information and support, as well as contact with other people with a similar condition. We apply for grants from grant-making trusts, foundations and livery companies, and have a wonderful group of supporters, some of whom are here today, who fundraise for us in an amazing variety of ways. We would love it if you would like to sign up to our RDS fundraising newsletter to hear more of these stories and receive news of how we can support this community. We have had people do head shaves for us. We have had a gentleman drive across the Mongolian steppe in a VW Polo, and we have lots of people who take part in runs and virtual runs as well. At the end of February, we held a gala dinner called Mission Possible, where we raised 110,000 for the expansion of rare dementia support. And we are delighted to announce that in line with this expansion, the charity is committed to raise up to 7 million to create the world's first centre of excellence for rare dementias. If anyone would like to discuss any fundraising ideas or the new capital appeal, please do feel free to email me or my colleague Alexis, our Senior Fundraising Manager, who will speak about the innovative new ways you can be involved in fundraising for RDS, even during this challenging time. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Alexis Gebby and I'm the Senior Fundraising Officer at the National Brain Appeal. I just want to start off by saying a huge thank you to all of you who already fundraise for RDS. We really appreciate all of your incredible efforts, especially at this difficult time. My role at the National Brain Appeal is to look after all the amazing people taking on various fundraising activities for us. We have had people challenging themselves to run marathons, cycle long distances, climb mountains, and even take on skydives, all whilst raising money for RDS. We also have wonderful fundraisers out in the community who organise golf days, hold coffee mornings, host choir and carol concerts, and even shave their heads. These people ensure that more people like you can be supported through Rare Dementia Support. If you're interested in becoming one of our fundraising heroes, then please do contact me. I am here to support you with your fundraising, and I'm more than happy to chat about any ideas that you may have. While at the moment it isn't possible to take part in a sporting challenge or hold a big fundraising gathering in your local community, we do have some fundraising ideas, such as taking on a solo virtual run or walk, hosting a quiz for your friends or family online, asking for birthday donations in lieu of going out, or even donating money that you may be saving by not travelling to work or buying your daily coffee. Do get in touch with me if you would like to get involved. In the meantime, take care and we hope to see you soon.